According to the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul was the one who founded the church in Corinth. And he then stayed there for a period of time, and a group of people came together, and they were united in their love of and their faith in Jesus. It was a wonderful time. And they all felt as if they were very much in agreement with one another, and there were no divisions among them. And they felt knitted together in the same mind and the same purpose. But then Paul moved on. God called him to continue the work elsewhere. And I'm sure that as he continued that work, he paused often and he remembered the people in Corinth fondly. And he smiled as he imagined them continuing to move forward with one mind and one purpose. And as time went on, other people began to have influence in the church in Corinth. The Apostle Peter, often called Cephas, stopped by, and he was a great blessing to the church. Another man named Apollos, he was young and charismatic, even if he didn't know as much as he thought he did. He spent some time with them too. And a lot of people there really loved Apollos. And eventually there was this woman named Chloe in the church in Corinth, obviously an important leader. And she looked around one day and she noticed something. She noticed that the people in the church weren't quite so knit together in the same mind and the same purpose. And she worried that maybe the church had lost its way, that it was spending too much time disagreeing and arguing over things that probably didn't matter that much. And so she reached out to the founder of the church. She reached out to the Apostle Paul. And in that initiative lies the genesis of the letter of Paul to the church in Corinth. Either Chloe wrote him a letter with some other people raising her concerns, or maybe she sent some people to find him and speak on her behalf. But however it happened, when Paul received the message from Chloe's people, his illusion of a united church in Corinth working with one mind and one unified purpose was shattered. And that makes me wonder. All of us, in our dealings with the church, we have certain ideas about the church. We carry around notions of the church's purpose and meaning and how it's supposed to operate. And of course, we also carry with us these wonderful memories of times when the church was there for us to support us and encourage us through trying times. And yes, many of us also carry painful memories of times when the church disappointed us or failed us. So we construct these stories about what the church is like and what it's supposed to be like. This is what we do. We construct stories about everything, our families, our jobs, everything that's important in our lives. That's just typical human behavior. But every so often, I think we need to step back and look a little bit more carefully at what we are doing and the stories we tell. And I believe that Chloe's letter provided Paul with the opportunity to do exactly that. And that got me thinking. What if Chloe were to write a letter to our church, about our church, to Paul, What might she highlight? What might she write that would help us to better understand what we are here to do? Dear Paul, she might write, I know it was your intention when you, together, I suppose, with St. Andrew, founded the Church of St. Andrew's Hespeler Presbyterian Church. It was your intention that we should all be in agreement, that there should be no divisions among us, that we should be knit together in the same mind and the same purpose. But I got to tell you, Paul, it doesn't always seem to work out like that. Yeah, that's right. There are divisions among us. I guess it's because different people came to be part of the church at different times. Some were baptized, some were born, some just came along and joined. And for each individual, there is a time when the congregation was most meaningful to them. You know, when they were at particular points in their own lives, where the life of the congregation really fed them, really nourished them. What I mean to say is this. Each of us says, I belong to the era of Wally, or I belong to the time of Kevin, or I belong to Jeff, or I belong to Scott. If Chloe were to write a letter about our congregation, would that be what she noticed? I mean, yes, I'm sure she would highlight lots of good things. She would talk about our amazing outreach we do in the community. She'd no doubt talk about some wonderful spiritual experiences that people have. But what if that, in particular, would be one thing that would stand out for someone who spent some time among us? You see, the church exists so that we might come together, so that we might, as Paul says, be knit together in the same mind and the same purpose. And that same unified purpose has to do with sharing good news with the world around us, sharing it in word and in deed. To put that another way, the church exists for the sake of those who are not in the church, or at the very least, for the sake of those who are not yet in the church. And so long as we are focused on that purpose, I believe it's not too hard to be in the same mind. But even if that is what the church is for, that's not necessarily all we experience in the church. We also experience very valuable things, of course, don't we? We experience friendships and encouragement. We get opportunities to exercise leadership. We experience things that make us feel good or help us through difficult times in our life. And these are all positive things, wonderful things that we get from the church. These are not the main purpose, but they are benefits that come from us being together with others who are of the same mind. And these are things that definitely help us to be built up in Christ. But the church doesn't remain the same all the time. Maybe we think it should, but it doesn't. In the case of our congregation, perhaps that change over the years in the life of our church is best symbolized by those periods of time that I mentioned before. And you know what? There were things about those times that were wonderful, that ministered to people in wonderful and various ways. And so you know what I think happens? Sometimes we become so fixed on those periods of time when the church responded to us, how we needed it most, and how we got encouragement and companionship and influence and more. And when we become focused on that, we can get stuck. And we start to be more focused on what we are getting from the church when it's responding to our particular needs in a direct way. And we see that more than we see our own participation in the ministry and the single purpose that we're supposed to have becomes kind of elusive. And I'm not saying, of course, I'm not saying at all that we shouldn't get anything from the life of the church. I'm just saying that when we spend all our energy measuring and finding that support lacking, it will begin to break down that sense of a unified mind and a unified purpose. So what do we do with all of that? Well, I think it really ought to turn us into Chloe's people. That we ought to be willing to take a good look at who we are, what draws us together, what may be pulling us apart. And that is, my friends, what we are trying to do today. We have asked all of you to take part in sessions today and at other times and to tell us what you see about the unique strengths and calling that you find God has placed upon this congregation. We've asked everyone to participate in sessions where we're going to ask questions like, in what ways is St. Andrew's Hespeler a source of delight to God? What are our strengths, our assets, our opportunities? What do we do really well? And what are our challenges and our fears? And we even dare to ask questions like, what are some of the things in our past that impact us? And we'll talk, of course, about the struggles we face in the present. And I hope you will not be afraid to speak openly and honestly to such questions. Because you know what? That's what Chloe's people did. And you know what the result of that was? Paul wrote back. He wrote back one of the most important letters, I would say, that has ever been written. The first letter to the Corinthians. It's my hope, my prayer, that through this process we will be able to get a fresh look at this congregation and a fresh impression about what God is calling us to be at this moment in time. And it's exciting. And I'm thankful to everyone who's willing to be part of it all. But I suspect that just as Paul was giving some warnings to the church in Corinth, there are probably some things he might caution us about in this process as well. You know, in some ways, this kind of process might seem very similar to the sort of thing that goes on in the world all the time. For example, if companies or corporations are finding that their business strategies aren't working, what do? They hold a retreat. They have a visioning session, and they refine their mission statement and their operations, right? Political parties, other associations do the same thing. And that might seem a lot like what we're doing, but there is something about when the church engages in such practices that is different. In the world, the main concern is usually, when those who look at these matters, very simple. All of the stakeholders are only interested in one thing. What can they get out of it? What can they get out of it? Corporations and companies are only interested in the kind of value they can create for shareholders. Political parties are only interested in the votes that they can get for the next election. Club members are concerned for the benefits that they receive from their participation. That's just how the world works. Everyone wants to know what's in it for them, what they can get out of it. That is the philosophy of our entire world. But Paul is clear in his communication to the Corinthians that the church does not work like that. Do we get things out of the life of the church? Of course we do. We get growth and knowledge and friendship and so much more. But these things are not why the church exists. It's not there only to meet the needs of those who participate. Actually, I think that's why Paul says he's glad. He's glad that he did not baptize many people in Corinth. Because it was not about what he was able to do about them as individuals. It was not about the relationship he built with each one of them. That would be to build a church that merely conforms to the thinking of this world. No, Paul writes this: "For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." The church doesn't exist for its own sake. Doesn't exist for the sake of its members. To think that way would be to conform to the thinking of this present world. The church exists for the sake of those who are not part of it. Or at least, as I said, those who are not part of it yet. That is the logic of church, and it is foolishness as far as our world is concerned. The church is called so much to be so much more than any other institution, any other grouping in this world. It's a high calling. And so we ought not to be afraid to look at it closely and carefully and ask how we are living out that calling. So I hope you will be bold and share whatever God puts on your heart. Be bold to ask for more. And especially to ask what God is calling you to give. And if we do all of this, yes, I think we can truly be knit together in the same mind and in the same purpose. Lord our God, thank you for this process. Help us through it. Help us to take that honest look. Help us to grow. Amen.